Tansen to temtik nipin maskwa hatsigasun. Bonjour Anishinaabe nibin makwan dijnakas makwan totem. It's my great honor to be here this morning to join Treaty 5 delegates leadership from across the territory. I want to acknowledge Grand Chief Sati for his strong words this morning. I see a lot of my colleagues from the past in my days gone by in leadership, a lot of the technical people that I worked with as well throughout my tenure in leadership. I saw former Regional Chief Bill Travers, and reminded me of some of the battles that we've been through, in terms of dealing with different levels of government. I'm very honored to be here this morning. I want to acknowledge the pipe ceremonies and the prayers that have been had here. I saw my Sundance brother, leading one of the smudge ceremonies here today, and I want to acknowledge the Sundancers in the audience today. I want to acknowledge as well, Louis Harper, his dedication to treaty discussions, the treaty movement. Louis worked with us at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, him and Dennis actually. And of course, Doug worked with us, Tracy's worked with us in the past as well. And I'm really honored to call these people my friends, my colleagues from the work that they've done, their dedication and commitment to the efforts that we need to continue to push in order to move forward as Indigenous people with Indigenous rights in this nation state that we call Canada. I have a bit of a slideshow presentation here that I want to take you through today. And the starting point for my discussion always has to be, I think, from the center of sovereignty. The center of sovereignty that I'm referring to is that fire that burns in each and every one of you. It's that fire that gives you your sense of sovereignty, your sense of belonging, your sense of identity in the world that we live in. It's a very confusing world, a very complex world where lots of social boundaries and socially constructed barriers have been created to impede us from the realization of who we are as the original Indigenous people here. My name is Nibin Makwa. I received that name here in Treaty 1 territory in ceremony many years ago. We feasted that name, and that's the name that's been given to me through the ceremonies of the Anishinaabe people, my people. I'm also known on paper and documented in Canada as Derek Nepinak. It's true, I have a law degree. I went to the University of Saskatchewan, and I also went to Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. I have a first-class honors degree from the University of Alberta, where I did my undergraduate work. I studied history, I studied politics, I studied art during that time. But aside from being in the books, there's an important balance that has to be brought if you're going to understand, the interplay between education and who we are as Indigenous people. And I was very honored to visit many lodges throughout that time. And it was during my visits to the lodge where I began to really forge the identity of who I would become. And many of you know me from my days as the Grand Chief. And I have since retreated from that public space, and I'll call it a retreat because in many ways that's what it feels like, going from the front lines of the war that we're in, into a space of introspection, into a space of ceremony. And I've focused a lot of my energy around my commitment to the Sundance and my commitment to my home fire, which is my household, and the safety of my children. The education of my children is a very, very high priority, as it should be for all of us. I share this first slide with you right now because I think it's important to start, as I said, from the center of where sovereignty might exist in each and every one of us. That picture there is a picture of me sometime in the 1970s, the late 1970s, on the Pine Creek Indian Band, as it was then referred to. That girl with the short hair in the purple jacket, that's my sister Jennifer Nepinak. Some of you may know her. She's a lawyer. She's with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And in my family, interesting to know that I'm a bit of an anomaly because I was I'm the product and the son of my mom, of course. But she was 15 years old when I came into the world. She was going to school here in Winnipeg. She, of course, when you're young, you get that spring fever. Sometimes Sometimes things happen, and 9 months later there's Derek Nepinak being born at the St. Boniface Hospital. I was born at a time when most of my generation, I think, being born to young moms was being scooped up and sent off and purchased in some cases. Some of our young people were being purchased by families from government. Government was making money off of us at the time and shipping many of us off to different parts of the world, different parts of the country. I was lucky enough that my mom protected me and brought me back to the old people in my community. And my grandmother, my great-grandmother and grandfather protected our household with a fierce determination that meant no child was going to be taken from our home. And that's the way we were raised. That's the way things were back then. Even if it meant that 5 or 6 of us or 7 of us kids were living under the same roof, that was going to be okay because we were going to take care of one another. And that's where I started from. That's where my journey begins, in this world and in this life. And I also mentioned my sister because she's the first one to go to law school in my family. And when she went, I thought, hey, you know what? Maybe I can do that too. And I think that's an important message when we see young people succeeding in education because they pave the way for their brothers and their sisters in the next generation to say, hey, you know what? I can do that too. And education is so very important at this very confusing and complex time in the world. Much of my presentation is focused around some of the things that have already been discussed at great length by some of the previous speakers. We've got experts here in law and in policy, international law and policy. You've benefited from hearing from people like Paul Chartrand yesterday, who talks about international law and international rights, and also one of the commissioners on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People that was done back in the 90s. You've heard from Saul Sanderson. You've heard from Rory Hawkwitz. These people are brilliant minds of our time, and we're very, very, I think, very, very lucky to have them come into the room here and share the wonderful ideas and thoughts and teachings with you. As we know, from treaty, the paper that the treaty is written on is not the treaty. We have to recognize that the spirit and intent is the treaty, not the words on the paper. And the spirit and intent of treaty has always come from the inherent rights and the jurisdiction and the sovereignty of our ancestors. Nothing was given away. We did not cede, release, or surrender anything to anybody. What we committed to was sharing and opening up the land for immigration for other people to also benefit from what the lands have to offer here. But there's also a spiritual component to these treaties, and I don't know if it's often discussed because we spend a lot of time focusing on the relationships between human beings as opposed to the relationships that need to be discussed between human beings and our lands, because there is that third party to the treaties. It's the Creator as expressed through the lands that we live on, the waters that we drink from. That's a very critical, important part of treaty that we need to consider, because what it allows us to do is it allows us to see treaty and our lands and resources as more than just something for exploitation. It allows us to put it into a context of reciprocity. That is, responsibilities that we owe to the land. Responsibilities that maybe we've not paid attention to as we've seen people come in and exploit and take the riches from our territory. That to me is a key piece of the treaty that we need to focus on as things are changing. We're living in a world now of global warming, of climate change, and these changes are going to accelerate. And how do we try and create balance in that relationship? How do we restore it? That to me is something that has to be focused upon. We can talk about socioeconomic disparity. We can talk about the NRTA, and I touch upon that a little bit in here. But I really think that the future is about creating balance and restoring our lands to the pristine, healthy conditions that they once were, recognizing that there are very few pockets of safe land still on the planet, and Treaty 5 is one of those safe areas. My perspective on treaty oftentimes runs counter to what some people may believe to be treaty rights or a treaty rights discussion. I don't know how it ended up that way, but I woke up one day and began to realize that, you know what? Nobody can give me treaty rights if I'm born free. if I have an inherent sovereignty that burns within my spirit. Nobody can give me rights because I'm born free here. And that's the context, I think, that I've decided to interpret and understand spirit and intent of treaty. And oftentimes this runs counter to the discussions in the popular discourse around where are my treaty rights, where's the implementation of my treaty rights. I believe it's already there. I believe that we're born free. Nobody gives us rights in our freedom because it's already here. We just have to find meaningful ways of expressing it. Early on in my political tenure, I designed this graph where I talk about the original jurisdiction of Indigenous people. And that original jurisdiction is oftentimes being referred to as well as being silent in the treaty. These are things that were never negotiated away or never delegated away to anybody's government. That includes economy, trade, gaming, social gathering, language, family safety, child protection. These were left out of the treaty, but what merged into the treaty space was a reconciliation of settler society interests. Those interests are still there. They have interest in trade, economy, agriculture, and settlement. But out of that, we have to arrive at a treaty place, a place where we can reconcile differences. And that, to me, is where the foundation of what a treaty-based relationship really starts from, is the reconciliation of our inherent freedoms with rights and assertions from a dominant settler society that has come into our spaces and dominated many of the things that we once knew and once held dear. So that original jurisdiction, I believe, remains intact, okay? And I believe that it was understood by our ancestors and confirmed in our treaties. And that's the premise that I start from. You can't give me rights to something that I already have. You can't. And I challenge you to start thinking about your inherent rights, your inherent jurisdiction, and your own personal sovereignty. And how do you express that in a complex political world, a complex social world? How do you express that? That's what I think the task is at hand here, is remembering that you have all the freedoms. You were born with freedoms. You didn't acquire your freedoms when the Indian Act gave you a card, or when a bureaucrat in Ottawa sitting in a cubicle approved your Indian status membership. That's not where your freedoms come from. That's not where your treaty comes from. It comes from being born this way. It comes in the expression of who you are, where you come from, the language you speak, your activities out on the land. That's what treaty is all about, as far as I understand and from my teachings. So where did this Indian Act come from? And why haven't we tossed it aside? The original Indian Act was passed into law in 1876, 1 year after Treaty 5 was signed. There's never been an agreement by Indigenous nations to be governed by the Indian Act. There's never been a time where we said, yes, okay, you can govern us, and we'll follow that process, except when we start incorporating their laws into our systems, and we start affirming the Indian Act by incorporating different policies and different laws that they craft for us. And as many of you know, I have always occupied a space where I would try to protect the inherent jurisdiction, the inherent sovereignty of our people by not agreeing to their laws. Not once have I stepped up and said, yes, we'll market this for you amongst the people. I've never done that, and I never would. That's part of the reason why, I don't run for, government, federal or provincial governments, because I know what they're doing. I know what they're up to. And I say this with all due respect to people that are in there fighting our battles for us in those venues. But I won't go there, because I believe that we need to occupy our spaces in our original jurisdictions. And that's kind of where I stay. So if people ever wonder what am I going to do in politics, if I ever get into politics again, I won't be running for an MP position or anything like that, because that's not where I believe I belong as a sovereign Indigenous person. I don't believe in the provincial boundaries between, the provinces that they created, that they imposed upon our people. I don't believe in those boundaries. I'm not even technically a Canadian. Not at one single point in the history of my family have we ever pledged to the Canadian Citizenship Act. But I can guarantee you that everybody coming over here now is pledging their citizenship under Canada's process. I've been to a ceremony where they asked everybody to do their pledge, and I just remained seated through that process because I'm not a Canadian. And I think that's the question that we have to ask ourselves in a rights recognition discussion or a rights framework discussion, is who is a Canadian, who's a bona fide Canadian and who isn't. I mean, there's many things to be proud of in Canada. You know, there's many things that have happened. But I don't think that they've made room for us. And I know that their laws are still designed to push us aside and keep us outside of our inherent jurisdiction. I know the psychology of what they've done through policies. And I can't call myself a Canadian in that context. And I think that's something that we all have to go through. And that's why it's important to start the sovereignty discussion from yourself, and then from there expand out. In considering my freedoms and our freedoms as Indigenous people, I began to think about, why are we wrapped up this way? Why are our minds wrapped up this way? Why do we continue to be stuck in this dilemma, in this dynamic as Indigenous people, believing in their policy and believing in their governance structures and participating in them? And I began to see that we need to begin our healing process. We need to begin unraveling our minds from some of these processes that they've convinced us of that work. And I often refer to this quote from Bob Marley: "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves will free our mind." And I truly believe that. I believe that it starts from a self-recognition of where we stand and grounding our identity in our true freedom. And from there, we'll recognize that, you know what, maybe we have all the freedoms we need, we just have to act on them. As been the message that's been carried from previous speakers, we just need to act on them. So what did I do when I began to realize that? I jumped on my motorcycle and I drove all over the countryside, stopping in communities all over the treaty territories, all the way to the foot of the Rocky Mountains, amongst the Blackfoot people, amongst the Plains Cree people, into the northern parts of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, into the Dene territories, and even into Treaty 5 territory, carrying a message of freedom and bringing the treaty fire to each community along the way. There is reason and there is rationale behind the things that I've done in this role that I carried for a number of years. The messenger role is not an easy one. You know, it wasn't a joyride on that motorcycle. We rode through very, very difficult conditions. We rode through the night in the rain. When people say you're never supposed to ride a motorcycle through the rain at night, we did anyway. And there was a number of us, and Doug Thomas was on that ride. He knows how difficult it was, you know. These are the things that we committed to in recognizing our freedom and sending that message. We stopped at Tsuut'ina Nation. We addressed the elders in that territory. I was very honored and blessed to be able to travel with the late Elmer Crishane, who also carried messages throughout that trip. And that message was always about freedom, recognizing where sovereignty comes from. And that to me is still a strong message that needs to be carried today, because it's a message of hope. And our young people need to hear those messages of hope, and they need to know that people that are carrying the role and the burden of leadership are continuing to push these agendas forward for their benefit and into the future. Being a treaty Indigenous person, recognizing our treaties are not domestic treaties, they're international treaties, I carried a message of empowerment, a message of hope, a message of sovereignty to Colombia, South America. And this picture here is the village that I spent 2 or 3 days in when I was down there, and they made me a chief in that community. So although I'm not a chief in any of our systems here, I'm still a chief in South America. So it was a very, very empowering trip. It was a very beautiful trip to go down there and to see the struggles that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have in other parts of the world. And I share that with you because there is an international responsibility to your treaty. There is an international responsibility to carry messages of strength, alliance to different parts of the world where and when you can. And I was very honored that the chiefs of Manitoba sent me down there to be able to carry that message there. You know, the hardships for for the Indigenous folks in that part of the world are similar to what we've seen. A lot of these kids have to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and walk through the dark for about 1.5 miles just to get to the school bus. You know, that's the type of education system that they're having down there. There's no fresh water in the community. There's a truck that comes in once or twice a week with fresh water, and it's distributed as rations for people to drink. It's a very, very difficult situation that they're in. I also carried my message, the treaty message, the message of our territories to an international forum in Morocco, Africa, to the World Human Rights Forum in 2015. And it was at that forum that I shared that we are facing our own genocide here in the nation state of Canada. And I wanted people to hear that because Canada is very careful to shape the messages, to shape the information that comes from other parts of the world. Canada did not have a formal role at the World Human Rights Forum in Morocco. I don't think they sent any delegates to that meeting because they don't participate in that type of forum coming from that area of the world and human rights, because they shape how public perception is and how it's perceived amongst people here at home. So there were a number of participants from the Middle East, from the African countries. There were people at this forum that couldn't even live in their home country because they would be tortured and executed for their beliefs. That's where I first began to understand, you know, how messages are treated in different regimes, you know, in different nation states around the world. And I began to feel fortunate. Despite the difficulties, I felt fortunate, you know, that this is my territory, this is my home. One of our responsibilities is in alliance. And I also wanted to share this with you as well, because as Treaty 5 communities, there's alliances that can be built that can be used to strengthen who we are as Indigenous people all across Turtle Island. I think that when I traveled to Wounded Knee, the site of the massacre site back in the 1800s, I recognized that the grieving that's still happening amongst many of our nations is representative of the unresolved trauma that we've all experienced. And when we talk about truth, I think we have to recognize that there's unresolved trauma. And when we talk about reconciliation, we have to talk about it in the context of healing. Because there's a lot of people, a lot of our nations, a lot of our families that have unresolved grief from what we've experienced over the generations. And that's one of the messages that I took out of that trip, because one of the elders that was there was the granddaughter of a survivor of Wounded Knee. And she's very elderly now, but she talked about the unresolved trauma from the massacre at that site of Bigfoot's people as they fled Standing Rock to join their relations at the Pine Ridge Reservation. I encourage everybody to understand that history, because that's our history, regardless of the medicine line, regardless of the existence of the United States. Those are our relations as well. And they're proud and they're strong, and they want to move forward in a good way. A lot of it is tied to healing. A lot of it is tied to recognizing what we've been through and participating. And that, I think, ties into, you know, the trip that I went to New Zealand. Healing Our Spirits Worldwide is a forum for Indigenous people all over the world to come together. And I know some of you have been to this forum. There was a recent one, I think, just this year. And it's really about recognizing that need to move past the trauma, because I think trauma prevents us at times from moving forward in a positive way. I think it clouds our judgment, and it prevents us from recognizing the steps we can take as the free people, the free Indigenous people of these lands. Just to wrap up some of my adventures, the road to Niagara was in 2016. Some of you had participated in that. Some of you were aware of what we were doing. But once again, it was an initiative of healing, recognizing where we've been, trying to find our way back to who we were so we can understand who we are. And much of this treaty relationship that you may recognize today, it starts in the early times around 1763, the Royal Proclamation. I think that might have been discussed in a couple of the presentations. But what you may not know is that the term, as long as the grass grows, the sun shines, and the rivers flow, that was coined in 1763 at that treaty. And that's where the idea of an expansive Canada can actually be accredited to, because it was our people that protected that border right across the line from American incursions into this territory. So if there is a Canada that exists today, they owe it to us. They owe it to us as the Indigenous warriors that protected those boundaries in the early days. So I wanted to talk about that because I believe that that is where our expression of sovereignty can be recognized in the efforts of our people at that time, in the coming together of the Treaty of Niagara. Speaking more specifically about Treaty 5 territory, I looked for a map of Treaty 5 and all I found was a map of Treaty 5 in Manitoba. And as I said before, Treaty 5 is not just Manitoba, and we all know it expands beyond these provincial boundaries that I don't like to recognize. And I don't mean to be provocative, I don't mean to insult anybody, but we're not bound within these provincial boundaries as Indigenous people. We've traveled all throughout the territory. Our trade networks are ancient, our economies are ancient, and they go back thousands of years before the arrival of these governments, these colonial governments and their boundaries. So I look at Treaty 5 and I see vast wealth in that territory. There's a vast wealth of resources in humanity, in the young generations, in the fresh water, in the timber stands, in the minerals. That's all there for you. And the reason why that's important, to put it in a context, is because they've tried to take it away from us, from you, as Treaty 5 people, as they have done in Treaty 2 and Treaty 4, the treaty territories that I'm from, through the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, 1930. Some of you are aware of this, and I think that one of the presenters spoke about it. In 1922, Canada announced its intention to transfer control and jurisdiction of treaty lands and resources to the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Canada neither consulted with nor obtained the consent of Treaty First Nations to transfer the lands, water, and resources to Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Manitoba in 1930. And during that time, Canada purported to represent Indigenous people under treaty during the deliberations and was in a clear conflict of interest in the process. Canada representing that they represented us. That's still happening today. Many of the policy tables that exist in Ottawa are being populated by bureaucrats that work in the departments and in the agencies. They say they represent our interests. I've seen it firsthand. So they're still doing that today. And I think it's important for us to recognize that without consent, we cannot be bound by laws that we do not consent to. No matter how that consent is achieved, or the attempts to achieve consent, unless we're expressly part of the decision, then it's not our decision. The lands, waters, and natural resources within the ancestral lands and treaty territories have been and continue to be largely exploited for the benefit of government and private interests without free, prior, and informed consent, and without the meaningful participation of treaty nations. Treaty nations in Manitoba have been excluded from the meaningful share of the revenues, wealth, and benefits generated by development and activities carried out within the traditional and treaty territories of Treaty First Nations. Now, why is this important? Why is this important? Well, I think it's important because the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in Volume 2 at page 163 of Part 1 states, to be effective, to make things happen, any government must have three basic attributes. There has to be legitimacy, there has to be power, and there has to be resources. Now, how do you in Treaty 5 garner those three components together? How do you bring those three components together? As foundations of governance, legitimacy refers to public confidence in and support for the government. And I ask you, are we operating from a legitimate form of governance in the Indian Act system? And I ask you that because I know that the Chief and Council system in the Indian Act was created to mirror the municipality system that was created in other parts of what's now Canada. It was created to pave the way for that municipal style of governance to take hold in our communities. I'm not making that up, that's in the documented record. When we talk about power, it acknowledges legal capacity to act and includes the power to make laws. Are we creating our own laws to reestablish our jurisdiction? I can tell you right now that Treaty 5 elders had participated in the drafting of Agitchitabakanagewin, the great law that was recognized at the Turtle Lodge amongst our elders. And that talks about our relationship to the land in the context of unsustainable resource development that's been happening throughout our territories. I can tell you that that power is coming back, but where does that power come from? Is it in the expression of chiefs and council powers, or is it in the expression of the sovereignty and the jurisdiction that comes from our people collectively? Because there's no stronger voice than our people coming together collectively. Now, the important one, resources consist of the physical means to act, not only financial, economic, and natural resources for security and future growth, but information and technology, as well as human resources in the form of skilled and healthy people. Key resource issues include the nature of fiscal and trade relationships among governments, which affect the control and adequacy of resources. You can't have a government if you don't have resources. And I say that because now's the time to reassert your jurisdiction over your resources. I'm not just talking about the lithium deposits or the diamonds or the gold or the oil or the gas or whatever is down there. I'm talking about human resources, developing people, developing families. That's where our strength really comes from. All done in the context of our responsibilities to the land. Because as we've been sitting on the sidelines watching everybody else develop the resources from the earth, they've done it in an unsustainable way. They've done it in such a way that our actual very existence on the surface of the planet is at risk right now. Asserting our jurisdiction over our lands means recognizing our responsibility to stewardship and all living things on our land and water. In 2014, I went on the tar sands healing walk, and I walked for 16 kilometers around the site where they've done open pit mining, and they've extracted oil from what people call bitumen or tar sands. And in order to get that oil out of there, you need to burn 4 barrels of fresh water to get 1 barrel of oil. And I ask you, what's more important, 1 barrel of oil or 4 barrels of fresh water, considering that fresh water is becoming scarce in so many parts of the world? It's unsustainable. It's unsustainable. And these pipelines and these new mines that are being approved right now that are going to move that oil across our territories, they're contributing to an unsustainable activity that's leading to global warming and climate change. I sat with the chairman of the National Energy Board, and I asked him about these pipeline approvals. I said, what are those pipelines doing in their transportation of fossil fuel to impact global warming? When they arrive at their destination, how is that carbon being addressed? And he didn't have an answer for me. He did not know how much these pipelines contribute to the acceleration of detrimental effects in greenhouse gas emissions and carbon in our atmosphere. And these are important considerations to make because it's our children that need to breathe the air into the future. Our grandchildren need to breathe the air in the future. And what are we doing in our responsibilities to these resources? Now I ask you, what tools do we have in addition to our treaty to make good governance? The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in September of 2007. Canada did not agree with it at the beginning, but as we know, it later adopted it as well, conditionally or aspirationally, and we're still involved in that discussion. We know that Romeo Saganash has moved the bill towards acceptance of the Declaration in its pure format and in its true content. The Declaration is an expression of the fundamental rights of Indigenous people around the world. It sets out principles of partnership and mutual respect that should guide the relationship between states and Indigenous people. It also provides ways to measure and assess whether and to what extent states are respecting and protecting the rights of Indigenous people. The Declaration recognizes that Indigenous people exercise a right to free, prior, and informed consent when any matter affects the inherent in treaty rights, ancestral land, ceremonial and cultural pursuits, cultural and economic development, and community health and well-being of our people. The UNDRIP principle of free, prior, and informed consent is consistent with the express consent of First Nations sought by the Crown of Great Britain during the treaty-making process, as reflected in the oral and written record of the treaty negotiations. Now, some of you may have seen in Rory Hawkwat's presentation that nothing is created from settler incursions into our territory without our consent. And I believe that that underlying truth, that fundamental truth, is still there. And as I said, they find ways of trying to get us to imply consent through different policy mechanisms, through different maneuvers that they develop in far-off places and then impose in our communities and in our homes. Be very, very wary of what consent means, because if without it, they can't move. I ask you, as I approach the closing of my presentation, to ponder governance in a world of climate change. You know, one of the things that I've done since I've retreated from the front lines of political leadership is through my introspection, I began to understand that the greatest value that I can contribute is to helping our communities and our families find ways of surviving, you know, some of the challenges and difficulties that we have ahead of ourselves. You know, and in the north, some of the climate change events that are happening are more recognizable than what other people are experiencing. You know, if you're living in a condo in downtown Toronto, you may not recognize climate change happening. But if you're living in the communities in the north, you're seeing it every day and you're feeling the impacts. Governance in a world of climate change needs to become a priority. You know, in the management of human relationships and the development of institutions, that's important. But we have to figure out how are we going to survive in the coming years. Earlier this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that we have less than 12 years to implement sustainable strategies to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid global catastrophes and massive losses of life on Earth. This dire warning comes at a time when Indigenous nations are reasserting their roles and responsibilities over our lands and our water. Time is of the essence, I believe, is what the message is here. And we have a role in stewardship, we have a role in jurisdiction, and we have to apply it. It was mentioned airspace earlier today. And some of you may have heard a time when even the air would cost money. Well, it's happening right now. I've been in discussions and I've been in a learning phase when it comes to carbon. I was at the First Minister's meeting in 2016 when Justin Trudeau introduced Canada's climate action strategy, where they mentioned that there was a role for Indigenous people to play, but that was as of yet undefined. And I've spent time thinking about what our role is, recognizing that many of you are living in the most pristine lands that we have in this territory. Treaty 5 is still some of the most pristine land in the world. You have carbon sequestration happening, okay, where carbon is being sucked out of the air from the trees and it's being turned into oxygen. That carbon sequestration rate, as they call it in science, has a dollar value. And every square mile of timber in your territory has a dollar value. I know this because I'm participating and recognizing partnerships in the South Pacific where the trees are being attached to a carbon value. If you don't get on this right away as leaders, the provinces are going to take that carbon value right out from underneath you. They're going to do that. They're planning on doing that already. I approached the province of Manitoba in my personal capacity after my days as the Grand Chief were done, and nobody would return my call. But I wanted to talk about what they're doing for carbon, or what they're doing with the communities regarding carbon in the north, because that pristine land is where most of the carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere. That's the lungs. Your lands are the lungs of the planet Earth. So what's being done? Something has to be done. So I've aligned myself with partners that can help the communities. That's what I do in my private life. Because I think the time is now to start putting these plans in place. What's going to happen when they stop delivering food to our communities? because that's going to happen, and that's already happening. Look at the recalls of the vegetables in the last month. How many recalls have there been? These are accelerating. E. coli bacteria in romaine lettuce. They're not going to deliver that lettuce to your community with E. coli in it. We've got to find ways of rebuilding infrastructure in our communities so that we have safe food to eat. Because as it is already, a lot of the food we're eating is highly processed and it's making us sick. That's what health is about what we're putting into our bodies. We've got to find new ways of getting healthy foods into our systems, into our communities. So another way that I've been working on is through indoor farming or vertical indoor growing of vegetables and fruits. These are things that we need to think about because we might have thought about them yesterday, but now's the time to begin implementing them. Because we're not going to be able to rely on the trucks and the transport of fresh fruits into the future because of what's happening. It's been said that changes in law regarding pesticides, changes in climate may lead to a worldwide agricultural collapse for growing outdoors. We've already seen massive droughts in our own territories in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba. We've seen droughts that have impacted the cost of food, that have impacted the cost of bread. We've got to begin implementing strategies now, and you as governments have to begin implementing strategies now to start growing your own food again and bringing those messages about healthy food back to the communities and the impetus and the onus on us to move into that direction as people. That's something I'm focused on as well. The time is now to do these things. And this is what I truly believe. I share these ideas with you not because I'm trying to impose myself. I only go where I've been asked to go. I only speak where I've been asked to speak. And when the tobacco passes, that gives me the right to say the things that I need to say. So, in closing, I finish with a quote from one of my favorite people in the whole world, Nelson Mandela. Some of you are aware that I spent 27 hours fasting in his replica jail cell at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights because I want to know what we're doing for our apartheid. What are we doing to address our apartheid here at home? Because we have beautiful examples like this wonderful man here who dedicated his entire life to overcoming apartheid. It always seems impossible until it's done. It's such a simple phrase, such a simple statement, but it's true. There is so much truth to that. And I ask you, let's look at the impossible and let's get it done. Miigwech, thank you.